Hi. This week's First Chapter Friday video is The Lemon Tree by Sandy Tolan. This book came out a couple of years ago. I read it a couple of years ago, and it is kind of an account of it's about a true story. This is a true story of two families that both spent time living in this one house, and it takes place in um, a part of Jerusalem where there now is a lot of fighting going on. So, if I thought that this would be a good fit for not only is our reading challenge for this month, our library book challenge this month is to read a book about a culture that is different from your own. So for most of us, this book would fit. But also, if you've been watching the news and seen some of the footage right now that's going on of what's happening in Israel, and you're wondering how people can be so horrifically cruel to one another, this book isn't necessarily going to answer that question, but what it will do is give you a little bit of a history of this conflict that has been going on. The immediate conflict has been going on really since 1947, but really this is thousands of years of conflict between Arabs and Jews in this part of the world. So I think that it would be, if you have an interest in kind of getting a little background, a little history, and this book reads like a story because it is a story. It's a story of two different families and how they came together and tried to find some common ground, even though both of these families had undergone some very traumatic events during their time that they encounter each other. So I highly recommend this book. And I'm going to read to you the introduction and then the first couple chapters that kind of introduce each of the characters. So this is the young reader's version of this book. There is an adult version of this book as well. First words. The house depicted in this book is an actual place, and the lemon tree in its yard is a real one. You could see the place for yourself if you boarded a bus in the West Jerusalem terminal, rode west, climbed, and then plunged down the hills toward the Mediterranean, and banked up a two-lane rise until you came to a bustling industrial town in a place once known as Palestine that is now the state of Israel. When you stepped off the bus, you'd walk down the busy main road known as Herzl Boulevard, past the juice vendors, the kebab stands, and the old storefronts selling trinkets and cheap clothing, and take a left at a street called Klausner. There, at the next corner, you'd spot a rundown gas station, and across the street, a modest house with a pillared fence, a towering palm, and stones the color of cream. In this place, this is the place you could say to yourself, this is the house with two histories, the house with a lemon tree. So the next part of the book gives a bunch of maps that of Palestine, of this area that's Palestine that became Israel, and it shows them in 1936 and then 1947 during the United Nations Partition Plan, and then 1949. So it's showing Israel, West Bank, and Gaza after the Armistice Agreement, 1949 to June 1967, and then Israel and the Palestinian territories with Israeli settlements in 2005. So you can kind of look at these if you have the book, and then there's a map occupied Palestinian territory in the West Bank. So you can see kind of as you look through these maps how the ownership, quote unquote, ownership and occupation and places where folks live and who lives where has changed in this area, just in a relatively, in less than 100 years. It's changed over and over again. As you can understand, that would be very confusing for people who live there and difficult. Introduction. In early 1998, I set out for Israel and the West Bank in search of a surprisingly elusive story. Despite the forest's worth of newspapers and miles of videotape documenting the seemingly endless conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, I found very little about the human side of the story, the common ground between enemies, and genuine hopes that two people can live in equality and mutual respect on the same land. My assignment came on the eve of the 50th anniversary of the First Arab-Israeli War in 1948, known as the War of Independence in Israel, and to Palestinians as the Nakba, or catastrophe. I wanted to explore how this event and the history that followed it was understood by ordinary people, Palestinians and Israelis living in the Holy Land. I needed to find two families linked by history in a tangible way. I spent weeks reading Israeli military history, Palestinian oral history, and scholarly works, looking at the roots of the conflict. I traveled from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, from Ramallah to Hebron to Gaza, digging for the human story that would move beyond the heartbreaking images transmitted from the region. I encountered many dead ends, but then I came across something real. It was the true story of one house, two families, and a common history emanating from the walls of Jerusalem stone and the coastal plain east of Tel Aviv and Jaffa. From a single house and the lemon tree in its garden lay a path to the histories, both separate and intertwined, of two families, the Kayuris and the Ashkenazis, and to the larger story of two peoples in one land. Their family histories allowed me to go beyond the familiar story of pain and retaliation. As I began interviews with Bashir Kairi in Ramallah and Dalia Eshkenazi Landau in Jerusalem, I quickly saw that I would cross new landscape to the twin hearts of the story. Like many Americans, I grew up with one part of the history as told through the heroic birth of Israel out of the Holocaust. The mother of one of my schoolmates had lived in Anne Frank's neighborhood, even played marbles with Anne Frank as a child. Her family escaped on a ship from Amsterdam, just in time before the Nazis arrived. I knew of Israel as a safe haven for the Jews. I knew nothing about the Arab side. For millions of Americans, Jew and Gentile, it was the same. They too were raised with the version of the Middle Eastern story as told in Exodus, Leon Uris's highly influential mega bestseller, later made into a movie starring legendary actor Paul Newman. In Uris's engaging novel, Palestinians are alternately pathetic or malicious, or perhaps even worse, they have no real claim to the land. If the Arabs of Palestine loved their land, they could not have been forced from it, much less run from it without real cause. But, as generations of historians have since documented, and as Dalia and Bashir recounted to me in their own words, the actual history of the two people's relations is far more complex, not to mention richer and more interesting. The Lemon Tree, the book you're holding, is entirely a work of nonfiction. In other words, I didn't make anything up. While many of the events described here happened decades ago, their retelling is based on hundreds of interviews, documents from historical archives, published and unpublished memoirs, newspaper clippings, radio and television recordings, and many other historical accounts. For this book, I conducted interviews in Israel, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Bulgaria over a period of 7 years. I visited archives in Jerusalem, Ramallah, Beirut, Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, London, New York, and Austin, Texas. And there are about 20 pages at the end of this book that list all the sources that were used for this book. I first told the story of Dalia and Bashir in a documentary broadcast on the NPR program Fresh Air in May 1998 on the anniversary of the first day of the 1948 war, or the Nakba, or the War of Independence. But a radio program is one thing. A book rich with family stories and decades of history is something else completely. My challenge was to keep the two people and families, one Palestinian and one Israeli, at the center of the book. I wanted to write a history book in disguise and make it feel throughout like a good novel, even though the story is true. Chapter 1. So that was like the introduction to the whole story written by the author. Chapter 1. Bashir. Bashir Kairi approached a mirror in the washroom of Israel's West Jerusalem bus station. The young Arab man stood alone before a row of porcelain basins and leaned forward, studying himself. He turned his head slightly, left to right and back again. He smoothed his hair, nudged his tie, and pinched his clean-shaven face. He was making certain that all of this was real. For nearly 2 decades, since he was 6 years old, Bashir had been planning for this journey. It was the breath, the currency, the bread of his family, of every family he knew. It was what everyone talked about all the time: return. In exile, there was little else worth dreaming about. Bashir gazed at his reflection. Are you ready for this journey? He asked himself. Are you worthy of it? It seemed his destiny to return to the place he'd mainly only heard about and mostly couldn't remember. It felt as if he were being drawn back by hidden magic, as if he were preparing to meet a secret long-lost partner. He wanted to look good. Bashir! Yelled his cousin Yasser, snapping the younger man back to the moment in the bus station's men's room. Yalla, come on, the bus is leaving. The two men walked into the large waiting hall of the terminal, where their cousin, Giath, was waiting. It was almost noon on a hot day in July 1967. All around Bashir, Yasser, and Giath, strangers rushed past. Israeli women in white blouses and long dark skirts, men in wide-brimmed black hats and white beards, and children with side locks. The cousins hurried toward their bus. They had come that morning from Ramallah, a Palestinian hill town, half an hour to the north where they lived as refugees. Before they left, the cousins had asked their friends and neighbors how to navigate this alien world called Israel. Which bus should we take? How much does a ticket cost? How do we buy it? Will anyone check our papers once we board the bus? What will they do if they find out we are Palestinians? Bashir and his cousins had left Ramallah in the late morning. They rode south in a group taxi to East Jerusalem and arrived at the walls of the Old City, the end of the first leg of their journey. Only weeks before, those walls had been the site of fierce combat, leading to devastation for the Arabs and the occupation of East Jerusalem by Israel. Emerging from the taxi, the cousins could see soldiers stationed at Damascus Gate, the northern entrance to the Old City. From there, the three men turned west and walked away from the ancient walls. They crossed an invisible line. The line was the boundary between two nations. Until a few weeks before, the line had divided West Jerusalem and Israel from Arab East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Now, after the defeat of the Arabs in the Six-Day War, Israeli forces occupied the West Bank, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights, and were defending the new frontiers. Bashir and his cousins had found it easy to cross into a territory both old and new. They trudged in the heat for several miles, down crowded lanes and past stone houses that seemed vaguely familiar. Finally, the narrow streets had given way to busy modern avenues, where the West Jerusalem bus station had come into view. The young men hurried across the concrete terminal floor, past the station agents pushing tickets through metal bars, past the kiosks selling candies, gum, and newspapers in a language they could not recognize. On the platforms at the far end of the terminal stood buses bound for lands they had only heard about, the forests in the north, the southern desert, the coastal plain. Bashir and his cousin held their tickets to Al-Ramla and hurried toward platform 10, where their bus, painted in waves of aqua and white, was ready to take them home. With a low rumble and a burst of exhaust, the bus began to descend the hills west of Jerusalem, taking the three cousins toward their hometown. They had boarded the bus with a prior agreement not to sit together, thus reducing any suspicion among the other passengers about their identity. By sitting apart, each cousin could also have a window seat to take in every inch of the journey home. They sat one behind the other, absorbing the scenery. Bashir wasn't sure if he wanted the trip to go quickly or slowly. If it went quickly, he would be in Al-Ramla sooner. But if time slowed down, he could more fully take in each bend, each landmark, each piece of his own history. The bus roared up the curving highway toward the crest of the famous hilltop at Kastal. Here, a great Arab commander had fallen in battle 19 years earlier, breaking the back of his people's army and opening the road to the holy city for the enemy. Behind the hilltop, Bashir could see the stone minarets of the mosque at Abu Ghosh, one of the few Arab villages that remained standing on the road between Jerusalem and the sea. The village leaders there had collaborated with the enemy, and their village had been spared. Bashir looked upon the mosque's minarets with mixed feelings. The bus sped down the hillside, easing up as the mountain walls closed in, and then opened to a broad valley below. 8 centuries earlier, Bashir's Arab ancestors had battled Christian invaders in hand-to-hand combat, repelling them for a time. Along the roadside, Bashir saw burned carcasses of vehicles blown up 19 years earlier in the most recent war. and wreaths and fading flowers laid alongside them. The Israelis who had placed these wreaths were honoring what they called their war for independence. To Bashir, this same event was known as the Nabka, or catastrophe. In the valley, they passed irrigated wheat fields and angled up a low rise. Near the village of Latrun, Bashir suddenly recalled a journey made in haste and fear nearly 2 decades before. The details were hard to remember, since they were from events that happened when he was 6 years old, events he had brooded about nearly every day for the past 19 years. Bashir glanced at the Israeli man seated next to him, who was absorbed in a book. Looking out the window meant nothing to this man, Bashir thought. Perhaps he'd seen the view many times already. Decades later, Bashir would recall feeling jealous of the man's inattention to the landscape. The bus hit a bump. It was the railroad crossing. Simultaneously, the 3 cousins experienced a familiar sensation grooved into their memories by a repetition from 19 years before. Bashir and his cousins knew they had arrived in Al-Ramla. They emerged from the bus into a hot, glaring world that seemed both bizarre and familiar. Bashir could see the old municipality building and the town cinema, and the edge of the neighborhood where he and his cousins had been raised. But none of the streets seemed familiar, at least not at first. They all had new names. Most of the old buildings were covered with brightly colored signs in blocky Hebrew lettering. Some of the buildings' archways, remnants of the original flowing cursive Arabic letters, remained. Yasser, the oldest, spotted something he knew, the old neighborhood butcher shop. He hurried inside with his cousins following, and threw his arms around the butcher, kissing both his cheeks in the customary way of the Arabs. "Abu Muhammad," he shouted. The Jewish butcher couldn't have been more startled. Abu Muhammad had left many years before. The new butcher's name was Mordecai. He invited the cousins to stay for kebab, but they were too stunned by the butcher's true identity and too distracted by their mission to accept his offer of food. They walked out, flustered. "You are pretending you know everything here," Giath teased Yasser. "You don't know anything here." The cousins turned a corner and found themselves in the quieter streets of the neighborhood where they once played. They felt at ease and happy, and they forgot their earlier concern about speaking to one another. They spoke openly in their mother tongue. They approached the door of Yasser's house, and he stepped forward to knock. A woman came out, looking at them strangely. "Please," Yasser said, "all we want is to see the house we lived in before." The woman grew agitated. "If you don't leave, I will call the police," she screamed. The cousins tried to calm her, explaining their purpose. The woman continued shouting, taking a step forward and shoving them back. Neighbors began opening their doors. Eventually, the cousins realized they might soon find themselves in trouble with the local authorities, and they hurried away. Yasser drifted along in a silent daze. It was as if he had no soul, Bashir later recounted. He was a walking body, nothing more. "I cannot accept such a feeling," Yasser said finally. "It is something I cannot bear." Soon they came to the house where Giath had grown up. Outside was a large sign they couldn't read and a guard armed with a machine gun. The 2-story house was now a school. The guard told the young men to wait while he went inside. She told them they could... sorry. A moment later, the principal came out and invited them in for tea. She told them they could walk through the rooms when the class period ended, and she left them in her office to wait. They silently sipped their tea. Giath removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. He put them back on and tried to look cheerful. "I can't control my feelings," he whispered. "I know," Bashir said quietly. "I understand." When the principal returned, she invited them to tour the house. They did so. Giath cried the whole time. After their visit, they walked in the direction of Bashir's old home. No one could remember exactly where it was. Bashir recalled that it had both a front door and a back door that faced a side street. It had a front gate with a bell, a flowing fitna tree in the front yard, and a lemon tree in the back. After walking in circles in the heat, Bashir realized he'd found the house. He heard a voice from somewhere deep inside himself. "This is your home." Bashir and his cousins approached the house. Everything depended on the reception, Bashir told himself. He couldn't know what the outcome would be, especially after what had happened to Yasser. It all depends, he said, on who is on the other side of the door. Chapter 2, Dalia. On that same July day, Dalia Ashkenazi sat alone at the kitchen table of the only home she had ever known. Sunlight streamed in through the south-facing windows of the stone house as she sipped her tea and ate black bread spread thick with Bulgarian cheese. Dalia had no special plans for the day. She could catch up on her summer reading for the university where she studied English literature, or she could look contentedly into the depths of the jacaranda tree as she'd done countless times before. In recent days, life in Dalia's home in her hometown of Ramla had returned to normal as could be expected, at least in the Israel of 1967. The air raids had ended, and Dalia's parents were back at work. The young woman had time to ponder her emotions of the past few months. First had been the unbearable tension and the trauma before the 6 days of war. Unfamiliar voices broadcasting from Cairo told her people to go back where they came from or be pushed into the sea. Some Israelis thought the threats were funny, but for Dalia, whose family had been through the Holocaust, it was impossible to fully express the depths of fear that those threats awakened. For a month before the war, Dalia had felt that the end was coming. Not just the disintegration of the state, but the end of us as a people, she remembered. Alongside this fear was a determination born from the Holocaust, to never again be led like sheep to the slaughter. Late on the first night of the 6-day war, Dalia learned that Israel had destroyed the enemy's air force. She knew then that the outcome of the war was essentially decided. Dalia believed that God had a hand in Israel's survival and had compared her own feelings of awe and wonder with the feelings she imagined her Jewish ancestors had had when witnessing the parting of the Red Sea. Dalia's parents had grown up in Bulgaria, married in 1940, survived Bulgaria's pro-Nazi government, and moved to Israel after World War II. Dalia was 11 months old when she arrived. Dalia's family had been spared the atrocities in Bulgaria by acts of goodwill from Christians she was raised to admire and remember. Now she believed her people had a destiny to live on the land of Israel. This was partly why she believed what she had been told. The Arabs who had lived in this house and in hundreds of other stone homes in her city had simply run away. Dalia rinsed her morning dishes, wiped her hands on a towel, and walked to the kitchen doorway, which opened onto the garden. In recent days, she'd been carrying on a silent dialogue with God that she began as a child. Why, she thought, would you allow Israel to be saved during the 6-day war, yet not prevent the genocide during the Holocaust? Why would you empower Israel's warriors to vanquish its enemies, yet stand by while my people were branded and slaughtered a generation earlier? For a child, it was difficult to comprehend the trauma of the people who surrounded her, who had been through World War II and the Holocaust. Only after probing could Dalia begin to understand. She had asked her mother some of the particulars. How were the people branded by the Nazis? Did they stand in line at the concentration camps? Did branding hurt? Why would anybody do these things? Over the years, Dalia's curiosity helped her to understand the silence of the children she had grown up with. Children she would invite home after school to try to cheer up with her elaborate skits and solo performances in the garden. Through the doorway, Dalia looked out at the jacaranda tree her father had planted amid the flower beds. As a girl, Dalia had loved to water the deep red Queen Elizabeth roses with their overwhelming perfume. Near the jacaranda tree stood the lemon tree. Another family had planted that tree. It was already bearing fruit when Dalia and her parents arrived nearly 19 years earlier. Dalia was aware she'd grown up in an Arab home, and sometimes she wondered about the previous residents. Had children lived here? How many? How old were they then? In school, Dalia had been taught that the Arabs fled like cowards, with their hot soup still steaming on the table. As a younger child, she hadn't questioned this story, but the older she got, the less sense it made. Why would anyone voluntarily leave such a beautiful house? At that same moment, Bashir and his cousins approached the metal gate in front of the house. Bashir reached for the bell and pressed it. So that's the beginning of this story. And as you can see, it's really written in a very story like narrative nonfiction style. So I found it really very readable and just absolutely fascinating to learn about these events that I knew a little bit about but didn't know very much about. And it just definitely helped me understand a little bit better the things that I still see happening on the news and that have been happening in this region for my entire lifetime and yours. So if you are curious about this area of the world and what might be happening there, or if you just want to read a good story, because it's a really good story, then pick up The Lemon Tree in our library.